What the eye sees may be the same, but how the different minds interpret what is seen is open to endless possibilities. That is the cause of the diversity and the differences we encounter all around us. That is how the world is viewed through different paradigms in different wisdom traditions. In Vedanta itself, it is possible to view the world in at least 5 distinct ways. The world as a cosmic sacrifice, yajna, as a cosmic play, lila, as a cosmic union, yoga, as a cosmic person, virat, and as a cosmic mystery, maya. There is also immense diversity in how one's own self is understood, and of course how the being that lies beyond the world and the self, sometimes used common term or overused word is God, is understood. Since everything is filtered through the same mind, the views in each instance are interrelated. If God is viewed as the father or mother, then we become God's children and the world becomes a cosmic home. If God is the master, we become God's servants and the world becomes God's kingdom or empire. If God is the supreme self, Paramatma, beyond name and form, then we become individualized selves, Jivatma, with apparent names and forms, and the world becomes a projection, Srishti, and so on. So all the 3 are interrelated. The God which the mind conceives would remain too abstract and considerably out of reach unless we are able to represent God in something concrete, even if it is a symbol or as someone we can relate to. Can God be engaged through feelings and somehow, at some level, grasped by the senses? The ethereal beauty of the colors splashed across the horizon at sunset and the innocent, pure smile of a baby, for instance, have filled people's hearts with awareness of something that lies beyond the boringness of this world. Getting to know people who are godlike also makes God more than merely an uplifting idea. Such enlightened beings who are said to be filled with God consciousness make God both real and accessible. The human tendency to grade, to distinguish, and to categorize everything assigns different labels to these godlike beings. So we have plenty of terms such as saviors, prophets, saints, incarnations. When we try to understand these godlike beings through the filters of our minds, we unconsciously project our own phobias, fears, desires, hopes on their personalities. Look, for instance, to how Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, Chaitanya, Ramakrishna and others have been understood and portrayed. Since we know little beyond bare historical facts of most of these personalities, how they are viewed is largely determined by how our minds understand them. It is the mind which transforms raw information into meaningful knowledge. Interpretation is a process of making meaning. Every one of us is an interpreter. We try to make sense of every bit of information that we take in. The mind is a processing unit. The quality of the interpretation depends on the quality of the mind. Those with clear and mature minds are able to produce clear and mature interpretations. It is helpful to remember that in every interpretation, the personality being studied is named by the interpreter, viewed through the mental lens of the interpreter, and expressed in the language of the interpreter. The interpretation and the interpreter are distinct and yet somehow also inseparable. Every interpretation includes the shadow of a self-portrait and the ever-present possibility of the person whose life is being interpreted being overshadowed or even eclipsed by the interpreter. How do these interpretations of these godlike people help us? In at least 3 ways. First, these interpretations tell us a lot about the interpreters themselves and their concerns. Second, these interpretations may help us connect the godlike person to our contemporary concerns and issues, thus showing that the person has relevance beyond his or her time and social situation. And that is why this seminar is not about Sri Ramakrishna in his times, it's Sri Ramakrishna in our times. How, when we study Sri Ramakrishna, we don't study him simply as a historical being, or what he was then, or what he meant to the people then. What's of greater relevance to us is how we understand Sri Ramakrishna today, what he means to us today, what he means to our times. So the third is these interpretations may lead us ultimately to the real person hidden under the layers of ideas, thoughts and concepts that every interpretation abounds in. Now with this in mind, let us take a quick look at some of the prominent interpreters of Ramakrishna in the last 100 years. The starting point for this exercise is the sources which provide the raw material for interpretation. The primary sources for Ramakrishna are many, but three among them are major. M's Sri Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita, Swami Sharadananda's Sri Sri Ramakrishna Lila Prasanga, and Ramachandra Datta's Sri Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa Dever Jivan Vrittanta. The Kathamrita is a record of Sri Ramakrishna's conversations, and the other two, the Lila Prasanga and the Jivan Vrittanta, are biographies. These three books are not stenographic, sterile records of the events in Ramakrishna's life and words. These books pulsate with life, passion, inspiration, since they are written by those who knew Ramakrishna personally, moved with him, talked with him, and were blessed by him. Even as M. Sharadananda and Datta write about Ramakrishna's life and words, they are simultaneously interpreting him for us. Their books seek not only to provide information, but also to educate and teach the reader. Through their books, they share with us their understanding of Ramakrishna, which places them among the first and the earliest of his interpreters. Swami Sharadananda's Lila Prasanga, which has remained to this day the most authentic and reliable research work on Ramakrishna's life, is not a conventional biography. Based on his own contact with Ramakrishna and viewing Ramakrishna's life against the backdrop of India's philosophical and cultural landscape, Sharadananda places Ramakrishna in the realm of the eternal Leela, the divine play of the avatar. He focuses his attention primarily on locating a unifying principle that would integrate both Ramakrishna's teachings as well as all the known events of his life. Sharadananda finds that unifying principle in the concept of Bhavamukha, the threshold of consciousness, which is his original contribution to the analysis and understanding of Sri Ramakrishna's life. Although the Kathamrita is primarily a record of Ramakrishna's conversations, and M took special care to keep himself as much out of the picture as possible, his interpretation of Ramakrishna's life and teachings is included in the book through several of M's reflections expressed in poetic Bengali suffused with devotion. Many of these reflections, mostly subtitled In the Mind of the Attendant, Shebok Hridaye, have unfortunately not been included in Swami Nikhilananda's English translation of the book. M's interpretation can also be found in several observations he makes in the Kathamrita, and usually phrasing them as questions. An example is the passage about Ochine Gach that I quoted in the beginning of this paper. After a brief exchange with Ramakrishna regarding Ochine Gach, M wonders whether Ramakrishna used the analogy to refer to an avatar. Now, through such interpretative questions, M attempts to encourage the reader to probe further along those lines. Ramachandra Datta was among the first to declare that Sri Ramakrishna was an incarnation of God. In his book Jivan Vrittanta, the reader cannot miss Datta's firm conviction that Ramakrishna was the embodiment of what he called the eternal and total being of Brahman, Purna Brahma Sanatan. And for this reason, according to Ramachandra Datta, all that was necessary for one's spiritual life was to remember Ramakrishna, meditate on him, and propagate his name. Datta interprets Ramakrishna's life through the lens of his own predominantly Vaishnava leanings, his language and style filled with his unquestioned love and reverence for Sri Ramakrishna. Among the other primary sources on Ramakrishna are the conversations of Holy Mother Sharda Devi, in Bengali it's known as Mayar Katha, the complete works of Swami Vivekananda, and the recorded conversations of other direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. Although these books do not have Ramakrishna as their primary focus, the intelligent reader has no difficulty in seeing how Ramakrishna's life is being interpreted through the observations and comments of Holy Mother, Swamiji, and the direct disciples. All other books on and about Ramakrishna can only be considered as secondary sources. Such books have been published in many languages. Those written in English have not had greater numerical distribution than those written in several Indian languages, especially Bengali, but the books in English have certainly been distributed over a larger geographical area. Partly due to this, but mostly due to the fame of a few authors and the depth of their interpretations, some of the Ramakrishna books in English have left an indelible mark on Ramakrishna history. Among the earliest in this class of interpretations is Max Muller's Ramakrishna, His Life and Sayings, first published in the year 1899. As a strong believer in the scientific study of religion, Muller believed that a comparative study would uncover hidden religious truths, and he was adamant that Christianity should be subjected to the same method of study as were employed in the study of other religions. Muller's belief that truth was available even outside Christianity had its limits, however, for he also noted that the history of the world was unconsciously progressing toward a universalized liberal Christianity. Muller had genuine admiration for Hinduism's philosophical heritage, but also an abiding interest in what he called purifying Hinduism. He hoped that eventually Hinduism would be Christianized. To him it seemed that his natural allies in this were the members of the Brahmo Samaj, the powerful reform movement in the 19th century India, and about which much has been spoken by the earlier speakers, which strongly denounced image worship and vigorously preached monotheistic ideals. Muller was impressed when he met Swamiji in Oxford and probably viewed Swamiji as a potential partner in his goal of purifying Hinduism. He offered to write a book on Sri Ramakrishna if he were given sufficient material to work with. Swamiji asked his brother disciples to supply the needed material, instructing them to include only the universal aspect of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. Swamiji knew that Muller's appreciation, though genuine, had its limits. Muller was sure to seek anything outside of his pre-existing worldview to be polluting to true religion. Swami Sharadananda put together whatever biographical material he could gather, and Swami Ramakrishnananda collected some of the important sayings of Sri Ramakrishna, keeping in mind Swamiji's instructions. Even then, Muller was not entirely satisfied with the material he was sent and complained that there were too many traditional elements in it. He divided his book into a lengthy biographical introduction and a collection of Ramakrishna's sayings and declared, and I'm quoting Muller's words, "Vedanta philosophy is the very marrow running through all the bones of Ramakrishna's doctrine." Muller filled the biographical section with his own editorial comments, seemingly providing the adult scholarly corrective to what he called the childish love of the miraculous. Based on the information he had received from Pratap Chandra Mazumdar, Muller also referred in his book to Ramakrishna's occasional use of vulgar language, his ignorance of Sanskrit, and what he called the almost barbarous treatment of his wife. On the whole, in spite of its occasional patronizing and chauvinistic tone, Muller's book is largely sympathetic and shows genuine interest in building a bridge across cultural and religious divides. As the best-known Indologist of his time, Muller's book brought immediate international recognition to Sri Ramakrishna and ensured serious interest from later Western scholars, among whom was the French writer Romain Rolland, the winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1915.